at the same time. My name is Nick Lovegrove. It's my honour to host and moderate this discussion. And I think a way to think about this session is really it's a masterclass in British public sector reform, public service reform of the last 2 or 3 decades, with an international perspective that Donald will provide. And, but really, we have 3 of the titans of public service leadership and reform in the UK over the last couple of decades. And I'll just very briefly introduce them, and then we'll get our question from the MPP student and dive straight into that subject. To my left, Dame Margaret Hodge. Many of you will know a distinguished leader in the British government and public service over the last 2 or 3 decades. Started actually in local government. I think it's always important for us to remember local government as a core area of our discussion. Was in the Labour government for almost all of the 10 years or so, 97 to 2008, and then most recently I think became extremely part of the public sector consciousness as chair of the Public Accounts Committee, where she held many people to account. And if I could just jump around a little bit, talk about Charles Clarke, similarly a titan of the Labour government, who was both Secretary of State for Education and Home Secretary, and also, of course, started in, had a period in local government. I respect different boroughs of London, I think Islington and Hackney. And then Baroness Simone, who's in the middle of it now and has been for the duration of the current government as a senior advisor to first to the Cabinet Office and then to the Department of Business Innovation and Skills, doing important aspects of public sector, public service reform since 2010. And then finally, Professor Donald Moynihan from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who will give us the international perspective, looking very much at public service reform in the United States and beyond, and has written extensively on that topic. So we're delighted to have this opportunity to reflect. We also had the chance to listen to the previous panel, which talked a lot about delivery and reform in public services around the world, so we're keen to continue that conversation. And to dive in, to get a question, a framing question, from Sister Sushant Jain, who is an MPP student at the moment. Sushant.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sushant Jain, and I'm a master's student here at the Blavatnik School. And during the last year, our masters has exposed us to multiple disciplines, such as philosophy, economics, law. And as far as performance and leadership is concerned, one of the things that I've picked up is that I think there are 3 main reasons why anybody performs a task or anybody is motivated to perform a task. The 3 being incentives, which could be monetary or non-monetary. The second for me is passion or interest. And the third is a sense of duty. And in my experience of working in public health in India, I've seen that mostly the leadership is trying to tap into the incentives, the financial or non-financial. So my question to the panel is that how can a leader whose one key responsibility is to inspire tap into these 3 reasons why somebody would perform a task? And can we really think beyond just incentives in order to drive performance in the public sector? Thank you.
Well, let's get into that. And thank you very much for the question. And Margaret Hodge, perhaps I can start with you. When you look back over your period both as a minister and chair of the Public Accounts Committee, what do you think has worked about public sector reform, and what has been most difficult, and what has been most frustrating?
I don't think there's been enough of it, and I don't think it's been radical enough, and I think there's an enormous agenda that a politician, which needs, I mean, the first thing I'd say, it just needs political commitment, which we've never at prime ministerial level, and Simone and I are on different political parties, but I think if one could get cross-party effort towards public service reform, that is the only way that it's sustainable, because you're then not limited by the electoral cycles. So I think we haven't done it. We've done too little. I think, where would I start? There's so much, but the problem really in the UK one of the key problems, there's lots of them, one of the key problems is that we have a very sort of, we always say our civil service is second to none, and I never know who we compare it with. But because it doesn't feel like that when you're looking at the outcomes, and we oversaw too many disasters. I think the key to improving performance and leadership, it's partly about duty. There is public service duty. I think it's accountability and transparency, and that's what we don't have. We have a code of ministerial accountability in the UK, which is probably mirrored elsewhere, whereby officials are responsible to ministers, who in their turn are responsible to Parliament. And officials are able, therefore, I think that's dissatisfying to both the political class and the official class, because politicians feel they have to defend their civil servants or can't, or have to take responsibility when civil servants go wrong, and civil servants can't be open about what they think is wrong with the ideas that happen. So I think a transformation of the code of ministerial accountability and having greater transparency and accountability, a really tough reform, which is hugely resistant if there is any civil servant sitting here, certainly at the head of the top of the civil service, they hate it, I think is part of the key to doing that. I think the other thing I would say is that the whole way in which we organize the civil service means that responsibility for seeing a job through and doing it well is never there. So you get promoted, you rise through the civil service by changing your job every couple of years. So you never see a job through from beginning to end. Policy advice is more valued probably than the ability to see a project through from start to finish. And I think changing the way in which we structure promotion within the civil service is the second thing. And then the third thing, I always say we get really bright young things coming into the civil service, the brightest and the best, with a deep commitment to public service. And then somehow we simply don't train and use them properly. So the skills are built around the traditional civil service of a past era when it was about giving advice, and not insufficient attention is given to the skills that are required in a modern civil service, which is about implementation. So, commercial, project management, IT skills, all those skills that are key to a modern civil service. And particularly today, when over half of public services are actually provided by third-party organizations, mainly private sector organizations, it's hugely important that we develop those skills to be an intelligent client. And again, those are currently not valued within the culture of the civil service. Sorry, it's a very long answer.
Can I ask you a personal question? You spent a long time as a minister, and then as chair of the Public Accounts Committee, you were essentially holding people accountable. You were the watchdog, if you like. Based on the reflections you've had during that latter period, would you have been a different kind of minister? Would you have done anything differently as a minister before?
Yes, I mean, I could. That's why I've tried to keep this
Please
close. Yes, I'm a minister. I've always been like Charles. I think we are people who are interested in delivery. There is a problem with politicians who always think the way they make their name is simply by yet another new initiative, which they never see, yet another announcement, rather than simply providing better value. I think the political class has to change a little bit too. Mm-hmm. But we operate in silos. So actually, when I took on the job of overseeing across government, I was taken aback by the extent, the just tumultuous waste that there is in public expenditure. Now, obviously, we looked at things that went wrong, but it is just unforgivable, and there's all sorts of reasons for it. It's unforgivable. And therefore, I look back and I think we just operated in silos. We weren't there for long enough. I mean, I think one of the things David Cameron's done much better is leave his ministers there for a much longer. Theresa May has been there longer than probably any civil servant, any politician as Home Secretary. We would, I was reshuffled almost every year. It's ridiculous. But I think we operated in our silos. We didn't operate across government. And we never had time to learn. We never learned from past mistakes. And I was shocked. I was completely and utterly shocked and taken aback when I got this overarching view at our failure, really, to provide proper value for the taxpayer.
Well, let me ask Charles Clarke, because you served in the same government and alongside each other much of the time. Similar thoughts, reflections on what worked and what hasn't over this period?
I think my core point is if you're wanting to change the quality of government, the quality of public services, the leadership has to come from the government itself. I think it's unlikely to come from within the civil service, certainly in the UK system. I'm not saying that can't happen in other systems. And so I start with what a minister's about. I often give a talk about how to be a minister. And when I describe how to be a minister, I always say that as a minister I had three particular roles. One was to set the direction of the office that we were in. So, for example, if I'm your Home Secretary, are you about tough on crime? Are you liberal? Are you reformer? If you're health, are you trying to transform the health service or just keep supervising it going along as it is? If you're education, are you really trying to raise standards for everybody in the whole country? Or are you focusing on the elite, or whatever it is? You have to set a direction which runs right through the whole system, because the complexity of the systems are enormous. The second role of the minister is to articulate, which is often underestimated. You articulate in Parliament, you articulate in the media, you articulate in speeches and orientations to stakeholders, to a whole range of different people. And the skill of your articulation is unbelievably important, and the way in which you make arguments is unbelievably important. So if you, for example, aren't able to conduct an articulation of what you're trying to do in a discussion with John Humphreys on the Today programme in the morning, or with Jeremy Paxman as was on Newsnight, you can divert everything that you're trying to achieve. Margaret just mentioned Theresa May, that last week or earlier this week she was at the Police Federation conference, and one of the roles of the Home Secretary is to talk to the Police Federation and set a direction with those people about what you're trying to do. And the same applies in every major ministerial leadership role. And it's very difficult, actually, to get a consistent articulation in these different fora so that people essentially know where they stand. And then the third dimension of being a minister is to take a whole range of decisions, enormous quantities of decisions in the famous red boxes, which arise up to here, full of papers with submissions that have been written by civil servants that you have to decide what you're actually going to do, and financial allocation, a particular new clause in a piece of legislation, whatever it may happen to be. And large number of decisions. You have to decide, if you're leading one of the major government departments, in my opinion, what are your big priority areas. I used to identify 6 to 10 subjects which I was really focusing on trying to change when I was a minister, and I did this as a junior minister as well. And on the other things, broadly assume that what the civil service was putting up was right, and kind of double check it, but not carry it through. You had to have an agenda. And I say that because having some sense of what you're about as a minister is critical. Now, that guided me in the big reforms that I personally was involved in. That I thought of 3 or 4 examples I just mentioned. Probably the biggest in education was the transformation of the university higher education system of this country, including the establishment of tuition fees, which was an extremely controversial piece of legislation. There was no consensus. I agree actually with what Margaret said a second ago about the desirability of consensus. But the Tories were determined to try and bring us down on it, despite the fact they all agreed with what we were doing. And all but one, actually. We had one Tory in our lobbies when it finally came around. And we won by 5 votes on the second reading debate. But actually constructing what the reform was the most important thing. And I came into office as Secretary of State for Education, asked to carry through this reform. There was a lot of controversy. There was difference of opinion between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Other ideas of raising money, like the graduate tax, were around. And so I had the job, with Margaret, of trying to work out what we would actually do. And I found the only thing to do was to immerse yourself in the detail of the changes and what would happen. So I literally would have 2 or 3 days where I had back-to-back meeting with the civil servants and outside organisations involved, By the way, referring to the conversation in the earlier session this morning, I would always talk to junior civil servants as much as to senior civil servants, and there is quite an issue. There are some ministers, including some I could name on the Labour side, and I'm sure this is true for the Conservatives as well, who don't want civil servants to contradict the ministerial view. I took the absolute opposite view. I said, if what I'm saying is a load of bollocks, if you don't tell me that what I'm saying is a load of bollocks and will have certain consequences, that's the job-threatening act. Because actually, if I haven't understood why what I'm saying is wrong, then that's a vulnerability for the whole system. Now, of course, it's then up to the minister to decide how to proceed, and you may ignore the advice that's given, but what you need is civil servants, senior, junior, right through the range, who say, have you thought about that? Have you understood if you do that, you're going to have this knock-on which you perhaps haven't thought about? And that's a very important component of the whole process. But for me, the reform process was about an immersion process in trying to understand exactly what the changes were that we'd put through, including the tuition fee proposals. I would say that our reforms have been broadly successful. I would also say that the changes made by the coalition government in 2010 made some mistakes in terms of how to carry that through, and it's a detailed discussion which I won't go into here, but I think there are things that set back the reform agenda. But it was a major public service reform with major implications in major controversy. But the thing which was an absolute requirement to do it was clarity in the leadership and direction of where the government was going on this, which in our case was difficult. If number 10 and number 11 weren't both on the same side on a particular reform, that made it very difficult. The second very big reform happened again directly after I was appointed, in this case to be Home Secretary at the end of 2004. We were anticipating a general election in May 2005, and our policy on immigration was a complete and utter mess. So, we didn't think it could sustain through a general election campaign. I certainly didn't, and there were a whole set of issues about how we were doing it and what we were doing right, what we were doing wrong, and so on and so forth. I again went into the immersion process, and actually immigration, though many people think it's a very easy subject, is actually an extremely difficult subject. And going through what we were doing, we produced finally a white paper in January 2005, which set out the fundamentals of what our immigration system would be, which have maintained to this day in Britain. Lots of arguments about what we could have done differently and so on. But again, I'm not going to go into the detail here unless people are interested. But the technique was the same. It was to face up to the hard problems about what you were trying to do in your policy. It was to have complete immersion and really think through what you did. It was to have proper discussion with political colleagues in particular. It was very important that the rest of the cabinet was on side with you, that your party in Parliament was on side with you, and ideally, if you could get to a position of working with the opposition, that would be very good too. I was very cynical. I'm not making a party political point here because the Labour does exactly the same in opposition. But I was very cynical about the possibility of getting agreement with the opposition Conservatives about what we did in these areas, because I thought they were opportunistic, as I think oppositions tend to be in our adversarial political system. But again, that was a massive process of change with very big changes that went through. And then the third example I'll just mention, again controversial, was identity cards, which was a massively controversial programme which I strongly supported. And it's a classic area. We finally got it through Parliament. It was a very long, very difficult process, a lot of controversy between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. But it was a classic area where we failed on the articulation, because the articulation of the policy was of identity cards as a national security device. And that's not really the argument for identity cards. It's about countering identity theft and identity fraud in a wide variety of different ways. And so the opposition, the Conservatives and also the Liberal Democrats, were very strongly opposed to the ID card regime. And one of the first acts of the incoming government in 2010 was to abolish the programme that we'd got legally agreed. But again, the same principles applied. And if you make mistakes in any of the, I've mentioned tuition fees, higher education, immigration, ID cards, all of which, as I say, were very controversial, and where we did have, broadly speaking, clarity in government leadership, except for the inevitable opposition from Gordon Brown on every particular proposal that one had in any of the measures that we put forward. But in general, we did have agreement in government about how to approach these matters. If you articulate it wrong, if you're not clear what you're about, what you're trying to do, what the structure of it is, then it's very likely to fall over in the process of trying to carry it through. But even if it doesn't fall over in the process of carrying it through, it may be you haven't got a consensus which will last through the next general election, which enables the thing to be in process as well. I'm not going to mention the other one I was going to talk about, was counter-terrorism legislation, which is also interesting.
Can I just ask you one question? You've used the term immersion a number of times, that your approach was to immerse yourself in a particular topic area, to drive it through. I imagine the life of a minister makes immersion very difficult because you're constantly being hit by events. And so how did you manage to organise?
I wasn't a very usual minister. Why by that I mean that what the civil servants like to do is to have, if you have a meeting with somebody, an outside organisation or whatever, they like to have a long pre-meeting to make sure you as the minister say the right thing from their point of view to the outside people. And then the meeting itself, and that takes up an enormous amount of time. I refused to do that. I said, I don't need a pre-meeting if we can have a discussion in the meeting itself and carry it through. And I was able to create more space in my diary than was conventional by not being ready to do a number of things which people thought I should do to fill up my time. And you have to decide your priorities. Now, in the case of these, all the examples I've given were big, massive, problematic issues. And what frightened me was if we went into bat, to use the cricket metaphor, without being clear what we were trying to do and not having thought through how we would deal with criticisms that would perfectly reasonably, the criticisms will be made. If we didn't know how we were answering that, it would take far, far more time dealing with that further down the line than it would if we'd really thought it through properly at the beginning. So I thought it was important to allocate time ahead of just about anything else to think it through properly. Yeah. The interesting question is, did we have the right people involved to discuss in the immersion process what was involved? And we did have a lot of civil servants. We had some very interesting outside people as well who had a lot of ideas and thoughts. It actually refers back to the discussion that we took place in this hall yesterday, early afternoon, I think, about what about strategic groups, who else can put things in, what's the role of academics, do academics ever have anything interesting to contribute at all on any subject that's relevant to anything, and could they come in any way? I mean, they're present panel accepted. There are I must admit, actually, I'm not entirely joking in making the remark. I think there's one of the things I do, Margaret and I were talking about it earlier, now, not in politics, is to try and find ways of getting practitioners and academics closer together, because I think it's a very, very, very serious weakness indeed that they are apart. And one of the strengths of the Blavatnik Centre, it's one of the very few places in Britain which is trying, as I understand it, consciously to bring together academic and practitioners. And I think that's a really top quality, important thing to do.
So the reason I wanted to pick up on that point, because Margaret referred to, if you like, this waste of money, waste of spend. There's also the issue of waste of time. I mean, the scarce resources are money and time. But Simone, if I could turn to you, Professor Christopher Hood in the session immediately before us made a contrast between the sort of Labour government of the early part of the century, which was trying to do more with more. It had a philosophy of, we can demonstrate that government can do amazing things, we will need more money to do it. You've been advising a government which is explicitly an objective of doing either more with less or the same with less, or certainly doing it with less in a period of evident resource scarcity. How have you observed that process of trying to do more with less? What have been the main features of the reform programme that you've been advising on?
That's very interesting. The more with less was exactly what we were trying to address straight away. But first of all, there was an awful lot of... Well, first of all, I'd like to say how much I agreed with all that Margaret said. And we did have... I'm sure, Charles, there was far more partisan politics in your time, but I was lucky to work on the Civil Service Reform Programme and the Efficiency Reform Programme, which enjoyed, for one brief shining moment maybe, a cross-party consensus that things had to change, that the Labour Party had had recent experience of governments, the Liberal Democrat Party were in coalition with the Conservatives, and all of a sudden there was this realisation, you know, they knew that there wasn't that much money, we would have to tackle the waste, and tackling the waste was, this is taxpayers' money at the end of the day, and tackling the waste was absolutely key. But I think primarily through thinking through how you deliver public services differently and better, and the creation of the government digital service to do that through digitisation and thinking about the needs of the consumer meant that you could actually do it far better and with less money. So we were conscious of that. But I do want to pick up on a couple of the points on the leadership to come into, because there is a distinction between ministers and the government who absolutely have to lead and show the priorities. But the job of the civil service is to implement those decisions. And while there should be complete challenge in a room with ministers, and very good civil servants will give proper, real advice about what you're going to come up against and how you're going to get through it. But the argument should happen behind closed doors. Once the minister has decided what to do, the job of the civil service is then to implement those decisions. And I think a lot of the problem was that there is a certain lack of capability and skills in the current civil service. And I'm not criticising everyone. The best are still the best, and they were fantastic. And there's a public sector service ethos that was outstanding. But the deal is that the civil service leadership needs to sustain the skills and capability of the service so that they can serve the current and future governments. And that's part of the deal of the impartial civil service. And crucial to embedding that, and I was thinking what would be my one thing that is a problem, and it's the culture. There's a culture that is deeply resistant to change, so that when you need to move on to be creative, innovative, improve the service, and you have a duty to do that, you need a culture and a leadership, a strong leadership, to support that culture of change. And you know, there are a few issues within. There's a class divide in the civil service. There's the blue collar, white collar, that people who are in charge of policy are more important than those in charge of delivery, which is absurd when you think that it's meant to, this is a service that's meant to deliver to so many people, and is in charge of the outsourcing, because ultimately accountability comes in. The policy, even the policy, isn't always as good as it should be. There's, everyone says, oh, but Whitehall shouldn't have a monopoly on policy. Well, you try and open that up and encounter the resistance at the top of the civil service. Funnily enough, lower down, you have more people who are keen to change it. And then how do you get the skills and capability? Well, you nurture your indigenous talent. And when we arrived, I was amazed to find out that the top civil servants were not being monitored with their careers and how that would fit in with the organisation. So you've got the best people to fulfil the minister's priorities, and then they say, well, it gets external hires, and you wonder why these external people coming in from outside are finding it so problematic. Well, it's a very difficult culture to come into. We commissioned a report, and the quotes were sort of eye-watering, which is, I tried to remember some this morning. You come in to affect change, and then you're killed for doing so. You encounter a club you cannot join, and you follow the right processes, but the patient's dying in the meantime. And it is this sort of, it's a very different world where people need to be properly supported. Again, we did a lot on the diversity agenda. This is a service that's got fantastically progressive policies. Why aren't we getting the best out of people? Why are we still not getting, women and ethnic minorities to reach the top? And actually, it's because there's a sort of uniform diversity now. There's a conventional diversity, rather than going out and looking at the people who will be a bit disruptive, who will try and affect the difficult change. And you can still get the people who, when they do that and they get it and they love working on these big, difficult programs. And that's when there's the real spark of what you can find. And you don't need to then pay the most amount of money, because then the sense of ethos, passion and duty comes in, because you're doing something really good.
Can I ask you, just in the context of the civil service reforms that you've been fighting to, where would you say you are now in that process? I mean, there was quite a lot of energy, with Francis Maud, and a lot of energy focused on that issue in the early stages of this government. Do you think that's been sustained? Do you see this as sort of an accelerating process or a decelerating process?
That's energy driving through her.
Yeah,
I would simply say when we published the Civil Service Reform Plan, which had pretty much cross-party agreement, and we committed to doing a one-year progress review, and every single year I would sit tortuously arguing with
accountability.
senior civil servants with sort of, no, you can't quite say that, it's not true. And they would always put in, the civil service is the best in the world, or it's the jewel in the crown. And,
second to none.
And one year I actually found a measure, and I think they came 11th or 15th in some international comparison. So, sort of, can we stop this nonsense? We have to sort of go on and say what we do well, and we do a lot well. So, all I will say is that I'm waiting for the progress report this year. I emailed to find out if it had happened for 2015. And
It is. Just as somebody who has lived abroad for a number of years, one of the most visible indications of change in the sort of is just the changed sort of architecture and just the way in which work is conducted. I mean, the oak-panelled corridors and so on, and of course you have many fewer buildings now as well.
yes.
I mean, I don't want to sell it for you, but it seems to me quite a lot has changed in quite visible ways.
Yes, and I think actually...
And more diversity, of course.
And I think that the civil service has responded to a difficult set of circumstances.
Yeah.
We cut the civil service like for like by 21%.
Yeah.
And we always say, there's no impact on productivity, but since there are no measures of productivity anyway, it's one of those sort of, where do you lay it? Performance measures are sort of not necessarily the most objective.
Well, let's hear from Donald Moynihan. The challenge has been set by Charles Clarke. What can academics bring to this? But I particularly want you to focus on how political leaders can work with management, if you like, the management of public services. Because I know that's something you focused a great deal of your own research on.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to go back to the question you asked, and I think partly in response to Charles. So I come to this panel, I don't have a title or I don't have the vast experience that people who've worked in government for a long time and really know how it works have. So my claim to be here instead is that I do research, and so we come up with evidence-based arguments for how public sector should work. And that's, I think, important because we don't apply that level of evidence to public sector reform that we do for other policy areas. So normally, to justify a big new policy spend, you have to have some sort of randomized controlled trial. In the US, that would certainly be the standard. And our attitudes to public sector reforms tends to be more, well, I think it's worked well in New Zealand. Let's give it a go here. And in particular, in countries that are grabbing these reforms and applying them in a very different context, what they're doing is they're grabbing a bunch of transaction costs that they're going to impose on their civil service, and they don't really have the full recipe for making it work. And they may not understand a lot of the pitfalls that come with that particular set of reforms. And so part of what I work a little bit with the World Bank in looking at performance budgeting efforts in other countries, but I also involve myself in doing field experiments of administrative reforms to try and get at whether they work or not. And so going to your question, which started from the issue of motivation, there's some stuff we know about motivation reasonably well. And so what you might call public service motivation or pro-social attitudes or altruism in the public sector context makes people more likely to join the public sector. There's reasonable evidence that it makes them more productive, more satisfied with their jobs, more likely to stay, more open to innovation if they can see the point of change. But one of the first papers I published looked at people's public service motivation over time, and the longer you had worked in the public sector, even after you controlled for age, the more that declined. So there's another finding there too, which is that the public sector is actually not a very good place to nurture public service motivation. And we haven't quite figured out how to do that. The second point that I wanted to make that builds on the first panel today is about ubiquity of performance measures and the challenge and opportunity that that creates for leaders. And I think we perhaps have too high expectations for what performance metrics can do for government and the relationship with the public. So to give you an example, when you get up in the morning, maybe you turn on TV, see what's on Sky, maybe you read the Daily Mail, you don't go on your website and think, I'm going to check out some performance statistics from the national government, figure out what's going on with those. If people do not live their lives like that. Occasionally in areas like education, you might look at schools. If you're very savvy and you have a choice between healthcare providers, you might pay attention to that. But for most of the government, the audience, the ultimate viewing audience here is not really the public. Even though it's good for transparency to put that data out there, there's nothing wrong with that. But the end users are hopefully politicians, but you can't really control if they'll use it or not, but ultimately public servants, because the public servants are the only group among that set of public politicians and public servants where you can sort of control their environment. You can try to change their culture. You can try and realign their incentives. You can try to force them to use data. And so I think we should think about the ultimate end users of performance data as that group in particular, and the purpose of performance data is to facilitate learning. Right? We want them to be innovative, to look closely at data, to have regular meetings rather than once a year or quarterly reports that no one reads, and say, well, what's going on with this outlier here? You know, and it could be a good or a bad outlier, but let's figure out what's happening in this region. So how do leaders facilitate those two things, the motivation and the learning-based approach to performance data?
And can I ask you to explain a bit further this fascinating point that the public service is not necessarily a good place in which to sustain a public service motivation, altruistic motivation. Why do you think that is, and what could be done about it?
So partly, I think when we join a job, we bring a lot of enthusiasm, we bring a lot of ideals, and then you meet the hard reality of what's feasible to do, what's not feasible to do. And this is probably true in the private sector as well. So some of my students go work for private sector consulting firms, and the private sector firms are very good at saying, come work with us, we'll help you change the world in a way that you won't be able to do in government. And then they meet the hard reality that you know, they're also there to make a paycheck and to sell services. So there's part of that, but I also think if you become used to red tape and bureaucracy and you don't perceive an ability of your workplace to achieve the things that motivated you in the first place, over time that burns you out.
Right. So you might go in with a mindset to change and to, but you get worn down.
Right, and you may especially get burned out if you stop seeing the people who are actually receiving those services.
Does that resonate with you, Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes to Simone's point about the culture. I did do too many ministerial jobs because I was reshuffled too often. But there was one department where I'd go in really enthusiastic at sort of 7:38 in the morning with my limited agenda of the things I wanted to change. By 8:30, I was tearing my hair out on officials who just saw their job just as getting papers off their desk onto somebody else's desk. And so the following year, when it came to the reshuffle and I was told I could stay in that job, I said, no, thank you. I'd rather go onto the backbenches. So there is a culture. We've talked about leadership of ministers. I actually want to talk a little bit. Can I come in back on some of these things?
Yeah.
I want to talk about leadership in the civil service because actually Charles articulated very well the ministerial thing. I think the thing that pulls down the civil service is that we've got a sort of closed shop leadership in the civil service in the UK, and I don't know if that is the same elsewhere. There's and they look after each other, and they are very resistant to change, and that's what demotivates people. So you get these young, enthusiastic people coming in, but 10 years in there, they know that the only way to the top is to be like the top. And you see it in the fact that when we do try bringing in outsiders, I try to bring in 3 people. I spent a lot of time in the Department for Education. I try to bring in 3 implementers for implementation of our under 5s children's centre policy, of a youth policy, and actually of a care policy for children. All 3 lasted about 3-4 years and then were frozen out by the civil service. And you look at the permanent secretary cohort, they all, I'm afraid, went to Oxford or Cambridge. Not that that is a bad thing to have done, but it's a very, very closed environment. Anybody who comes in from outside just doesn't survive. Just doesn't survive. So, a radical prime minister might actually bring a third of the perm sex, get rid of a third of them, put a third new coming in. Not necessarily private sector. Some private sector, because the work we did in the 5 years demonstrates the private sector ain't that much better than the public sector at delivering the outcomes. But some private sector, some people from local government, some people from health, there are plenty of other public sector agencies that you could bring in, and that might shake it up. Can I just say one thing on one of the things that Charles talked about, because it's one of the areas we looked at, and it's one of the problems is we did immerse ourselves, both of us immersed ourselves, and Charles in particular took it through in the higher education policy. And this is where a good civil servant might have helped us. We still actually took a very short-term view, and I was looking at some figures that the Office for Budget Responsibility brought out on our HE tuition fees policy. And that shows that by 1935, the debt from the fees policy will be £600 billion. We know, we have enough evidence now to know that probably only half of that will ever be repaid. And that figure might get even worse over time. I mean, it declines each year. And yet that £600 billion is 8% of GDP. And I'm not sure, Charles, when we thought about that policy, we really took that long-term view. And that's one of the problems with government, is the ability to really think long-term implications on, did we really want a policy which still today is a middle-class subsidy, because on the whole, it's the middle classes, that we're still not cutting through into people from lower socioeconomic groups going through it.
1935. The key, the key point about this is a very, very interesting point. I won't go into the whole discussion of the policy and the serious problem. I was joking earlier about Gordon Brown, but the serious problem, the lack of engagement of the Treasury in the involvement of our evolution of our policy. But the core reason for what, Margaret, you've described was the decision in 2010 to raise the point at which people started income, at which people started repaying. So a much higher proportion of the loans will not be repaid, not as a result of the policy you and I put through, but as a result of the changes in 2010. And David Willetts today, the Minister today, will confirm that it was a mistake, actually at the behest of the Liberal Democrats, as it so happens, that has led to the kinds of difficult financial issues you described. Can I just make one other slightly different point? I was very interested in what you were saying about the motivations or otherwise of people in the public service. It's not simply in the civil service. I regard one of my most successful initiatives as Secretary of State for Education was something we did called the London Challenge, which was an effort to raise the standards of secondary education in London. And it was a massive problem. And London at that point was bottom of all the regions in the UK in terms of their attainment. It's now top as a result of the London Challenge. And now what was the London Challenge? It was about absolutely being ready to take any measure necessary to improve the quality of education in London secondary schools. And the key blocker was the point you were referring to, that if the leadership wasn't there in a school, there were no measures at that point to change the leader. And so if the head wasn't up to it, or was coasting in the fashionable phrase, people say, well, it's all right, he's going to retire in 15 years. We'll bring somebody in then who's going to do it through. So what we did, rather disgracefully, as part of the London Challenge, it was much more than what I'm just describing, was create a slush fund which could be given to the London schools to buy out the incompetent elderly leaders, and not just heads, but also heads of department and so on, in order to get them out so you could get young and effective leaders in. And that was a key thing in the whole process, because of exactly what you correctly describe. The motivation changes through life, not just in the civil service, so that's also true in the civil service, as Margaret rightly said a second ago, but also amongst your educational professionals, your health professionals, and so on. But what do you do about it? And actually, that's a core industrial relations issue. It goes back to Simone's point about the culture and how do you deal with it. We didn't have, and we still don't really have, even after the bastard Tories have been in office for the period they've been, a hire and fire culture in the civil service. And so if somebody's not up to it, they have to really do something pretty bad to be sacked.
No, they normally get promoted into another department.
Well,
and you're so grateful to get rid of them, but actually you let them go.
It's the old joke about the Peter principle. The Peter principle. Everybody's promoted to the level of incompetence, and so everybody is incompetent in any organisation. But actually, it's a very true point that you've just said. But actually, that is the biggest single issue for all of the public service management issues. It's why we had privatisations, it's why we had outsourcing, it's why lots of things happened. It was believed that in purely in HR, human resources terms, the private sector would be more ruthless at dealing with the problems, and that public service management was not ready to do it. And I think for the centre-left in general, it's our biggest failure in the whole time that, 30 or 40 years, is our inability to face up to the fact that effective public service management requires good human resources policies, and that requires often difficult and tough human resources policies.
I
do
totally agree. I just want to say one thing on that you did, in fairness, take measures in government, because I've became a devotee of sort of books by various members of your governments. And one of the speeches that when we were trying to introduce this idea of a fixed term for permanent secretaries, an idea we got from New Zealand actually, and we sort of said that we would do it. The resistance was enormous. How dare you even think that this can happen? And all of a sudden, we came across a speech from Tony Blair in 2004, which he said he had introduced this very policy, and he thought that it had happened, and it hadn't happened. So, in fact, when it was presented to Cabinet, I remember writing, the draft sort of paper for Cabinet, and said, this was introduced by Tony Blair. Actually, it's not controversial. We're going to implement it. Anyway.
I do want to open up to the floor and just questions and observations. Yeah. Do you want to stand up and say who you are, and then...
Sure. My name's Connor Lyons. I'm an MPP student here, and particularly interested in the culture and motivation conversation as someone who, despite being an MPP student, has decided to not join the public service out of this degree. And there's a lot of conversation about bringing people into the public sector. But as young people, I think a lot of us are interested in oscillating and moving in and out. So I'm interested in if you have any ideas, particularly nuts and bolts ideas, about how the public sector can not just encourage the onboarding and the training of people, but also encourage a culture which allows them to be off-boarded and go in and out effectively.
Great. Let's get 2 or 3 other questions, and then we'll go... Yeah. A gentleman back there, and then...
Yes, I have a question on timing.
Sorry? Can you say who you are?
John Hicklin. I was... at the UK Treasury many years ago, and then the IMF for most of my career. I was very struck by the sense of timing here. Major reforms are being discussed while ministers were in office. To get change implemented, don't you have to have thought these things through in advance? And the equivalent, as we see in Washington with the government in exile along Massachusetts Avenue in Brookings and all the other Cato Institutes and so on. Isn't it too late once you're actually in government to do this immersion to be able to get things done?
Yeah. So.
Thank you. My name is Jose Puyana. I'm from Colombia and also an MPP student. Thank you very much for the incredible conversation. As you may know, our MPP has students from 55 nationalities. Actually, we just have 2 British students. So I would like to invite you to think about how to apply or how to analyze other cases, other very complicated cases, with your experience. And as you were talking about the civil service, I was thinking, well, my country's doomed because the civil service it's far from resembling the UK or the US civil service. And we saw yesterday in another discussion that one of the key aspects for fighting corruption would be meritocracy in recruiting personnel for the civil service. So I would like to combine these two aspects and ask you, based on your experience and past knowledge of what happened in the UK and the US, what could other countries such as mine do to incentivize a change in civil service when the people who are in charge of making the laws are benefiting from the current situation? Thank you.
Okay. And let's just get one more question. Yes, sir.
My name is Eric Keynes. I'm a former civil servant. I agreed with Professor Woods early this morning that what's been wrong with this conference is that it's all been top down and we've not heard from anybody at the sharp end of trying to implement these massive programs that everybody's been talking about. So let me humbly suggest from my point of view at the sharp end what's wrong. I ran social security operations for years. I was involved in 3 health service organisations. I was on the prisons board. I ran a computer service. And this is how it felt. This is a very humble expression of opinion because civil servants have been the easy meat in this conference. What happens when a major reform is proposed? Well, it's in a manifesto and you work with ministers for a short time to develop the idea. There is then legislation. By the time that's through, if it's very controversial, you can be 18 months into a new parliament. You then start to implement. A year on, ministers see that it's probably not going quite as quickly as they had envisaged, and they want to be able to say by the time of the next manifesto, we have delivered this, so they start changing the shape of the thing. At the same time, the opposition comes along and says, whatever you do, we're going to scrap this when we come into office. And so by the time you get through a parliament, what you started off doing bears no relationship at all to what you set off to do. It so happens too that in the course of that process, there is incredible interference. People at the top will not let go. Their fingers are in every pie. Select committees, you're called to a select committee and explain what you're doing. They criticise the thing. You have to change the shape of the scheme. You have to change the computer programme. The minister is arraigned in Parliament by an MP about a letter from a constituent. Yes, I want more information about this. Ministers say, we won't interfere, we will monitor broadly. Let's have 6 broad measures. That's a laugh, if ever I heard one. By the time you've finished, you'll have 50, 60 measures, all being required because of individual complaints about what you're doing or individual views expressed in the course of what you're doing. So please, I want ministers and people at the top to bear some responsibility for things that go wrong and not heap everything on the shoulders of those who are trying to implement them.
Well, thank you. And I'd be grateful if we could try to sort of bring those points together. And particularly, Margaret, you talked about the time frame problem of such short bursts of time. And the gentleman here in particular is talking about it takes quite a long time to get these things through, and they keep changing.
I mean, I hope so. I agree with lots of what you've said, right? And you then try and think, how do you get to an answer? How do you seek improvement in that? And which is hard. One of my answers, the changing of specifications was a consistent theme in our analysis of where money's wasted. So constant changing of specifications is terrible. The failure of somebody, I think the people who write the law should also be responsible for implementing it, because they might write more sensible laws. That could be an organizational change that could be implemented. And the other thing is, I think we could seek more cross-party consensus on issues. Now, let me take one issue, which is a complete nightmare, and Simone will agree with me, which is the universal credit, right? We all think it's a perfectly sensible idea to get rid of 6 separate benefits and to assess people of working age in one benefit, having regard to their circumstances. We all looked at it. I mean, Labour ministers looked at it and shied away from what is a logical policy, because of the complexity of implementation. Sadly, we had a Conservative minister who thought as long as he said it, it would happen. I hope I'm not being too offensive, Simone, but I mean, that was what happened. He came in, he said, we're going to change it, we're going to have universal credit, it's going to be there in 18 months. And having said that, he believed that was all he needed to do. But it's a very good, and it's a mess. And we've wasted hundreds of millions of pounds on bad IT, inappropriate IT systems. And even today, I don't think anything we're doing is really what any sensible person would understand universal credit. So if we had tried to do that in a different way, actually taking advantage of a coalition government where you had two parties working together, bringing in the third and saying, we all agree about this, it'll probably take us 10 years to get there. Can we therefore sit down and think about a serious implementation? That might have been a better way forward. At the moment, I still am very sceptical of it ever actually happening in its current form, and although there's the politics of that, and it won't happen. And then my final thing is, I want to come back to something I said at the beginning. I think the only answer is greater transparency. So where Simone and I probably disagree is I think we just have to have the whole way in which policy is developed and how it's implemented much more open to public account. We have it in local government. So, for example, when local government makes policy, it's a much more open process. I don't think that stops politics coming in. I don't think that sort of impedes political accountability. But it does mean there is challenged policy making because you've got to justify it openly. And I think that just might help us lead to better policy. Now, what will happen if, and then I think the civil servants have to be more accountable. I mean, the rows we had at my little select committee about, you know, we occasionally wanted the person who was actually running the project to come and give us evidence rather than the permanent secretary who knew no more than we did. The rows we had even about that sort of accountability to the public were ridiculous. So I think you open it up. Now, if you open it up, civil servants will be able to articulate more when they think a policy is bonkers and say that. And I think, again, that'll strengthen policy making. And there will be, but the price of that is they will be more accountable for their actions. And nobody, I can't think of, you know, in all the troubles that we found, very, very few civil servants are actually held to account for what they do. Let me give you one, it was a very funny example. We looked at a scheme which was the European subsidy scheme for farmers. It's set up by Europe and administered by DEFRA. The woman in charge at the DEFRA had run it for 5 years, and then she'd become permanent secretary at the Home Office. We got to look at it, and we were looking at her 5 years of running it in DEFRA. And I thought it's ridiculous to have the new person there. They weren't there when all this mess was going on. We were paying the wrong amounts. We were paying too late. We were having to give money back to the EU because of the mistakes we'd made. We'd lost a lot of money. I wanted the woman who'd run it for 5 years. She said, I'm not accountable to you any longer. I'm now a perm secretary in the Home Office. I won't come. I wrote her 3 polite letters, and she still refused to come. In the end, I used the little bit of power I had, which was to sign a bit of A4 paper, ordering her to come. And actually, my only sanction, had she at that point refused, would have been I'd have given her a little bit of time in a cell in the House of Commons to reflect on her refusal to account in the House of Commons. Now, that's sort of silly story. In the end, actually, the order was enough and she came. And actually, the civil service, thanks to Simone, has now changed to who accounts. But that lack of accountability, I think, is really, and so accountability and transparency and all the other things, I think, is probably keys to improvement. None of them silver bullets.
We're getting short on time.
Sorry.
But Donald,
I also wanted to, there are lots of great questions, but I wanted to pick up on the question you asked because that experience is not unique to the UK. No. It's certainly the experience in the US and in other countries as well. So from the perspective of especially street-level bureaucrats, they see these waves of reforms that have different titles, different acronyms, and they stop after 3 or 4 years, or they change fundamentally. And it becomes very easy then to become cynical and say, we'll just wait this one out, something else is coming down the line. The place where the US has succeeded in the area of performance management is the parts of the process that they've retained over time. So putting in place a performance improvement officer under the Bush administration, the Obama administration took that, putting stuff in statutes about how to do performance. That sort of survived the test of time, but the elements that get changed every 4 or 8 years just sort of fall away into dust. And if you talk about cultural change, culture takes decades to change. And if you keep chopping and changing the approach, you engender a culture of cynicism rather than innovation.
I also think the point that Margaret was making about local government accountability being more open, being more transparent, but not apparently preventing things from happening. I mean, that's a very interesting point. And I think the same would be true in the US. I mean, we were talking earlier about there's more progress in state and local government than there is in the federal government. And it's a much more transparent environment by virtue of its closeness to the customer.
You're closer to people and there's less gridlock at the state and local
Yeah.
levels.
Do you want to address any of the other points that have been raised?
Goodness gracious.
Well, maybe the in and out point is one that you particularly have,
I think
because you've been in and out.
No, I think in terms of this change of specification and whatever, you're doing things in government in a glare of accountability that is appalling, and it is very confrontational. I mean, the PAC is a confrontational forum. And one of the things that I think that is really important, would save an awful lot of money, is if you're failing on something, if something's not working, it needs to be stopped quickly. And the problem is you spend sort of £3 million and think, oh no, this isn't working. You spend £30 million to go further down. And universal credit was a very good example of that. My retort on the minister point was that if the minister is always being told everything is going fine, what level, that's a problem. And I think that too often, this is where you really do need the bravery of civil servants to tell ministers the truth. This is not working, and it's not working for these reasons. And a sensible minister will have to listen to that and take the responsibility for it, because they're ultimately accountable. But I do think that there's an awful lot of trying to push things under the carpet until they become worse. And it's far better to have a culture that allows you to fail, and fail fast. And again, the culture is not conducive to that sort of sense of innovation and being able to fail.
And Charles, the point about thinking things through in advance and coming into government, as it were, with a programme that you want, is that your experience? I mean, the changes that you defined were big changes, and you clearly had given a lot of thought to them in advance. You had prepared the ground.
I think big questions have been raised by this round of questions, which are more profound, actually, than the reform of the civil service. I edited a book 2 years ago called The Too Difficult Box, which followed a set of lectures asking the question why politicians tended to put into the too difficult box changes which were very problematic. For example, in immigration reform, for example, welfare reform, including things like universal credit, for example, funding of the health service in an effective way, for example, social care in old age, for example, funding of political parties, and so on. And what the book did was describe why these problems happened. And the why was because of the fundamentally short-termist political culture within which everybody, not just politicians, but the media, the civil servants, operated. So the question then arises, and this comes to the point about Colombia, is how can you achieve a long-termist political culture? There's very little of the detailed preparation before change that you described earlier, because very little of the political process is about those great clashes. There are elements which are sometimes, but I wouldn't say generally those great things happen, and the list of examples I gave didn't include those kind of areas. But I think the only answer is you have to develop a long-termist political culture. Now, what does that require in our system in the UK? We had a set of devices, things called royal commissions and this, that and the other, which were completely unsuccessful in developing a long-term political culture. It actually requires, in my opinion, the main political leaders of the main political forces to come together and say, we are going to try and work together to address these kinds of issues. Classic contemporary examples, other than what I mentioned, are big infrastructure decisions. What do we do about terminal? What's it at Heathrow? And so on, the HS2 rail link, and so on. Because those are very, very difficult unless you've got some kind of long-term approach. And in my opinion, that's what you have to try and achieve. But it's very difficult to do. I'm just going to end on one anecdote. I was a member of a committee set up by our Royal Society here on the future of maths and science education. And one of the things everybody said, rather similar to the points made by the gentleman there, teachers were completely fed up with the constant changes in the maths and science curriculum. So changes would come along and they'd be too difficult to implement and so on. There's general agreement. What you want is agreement between the political parties that you're not going to constantly chop and change the maths and science curriculum. You've got to have a structure which does allow change to happen. But I said I'd try and bring together the main political leaders on this to discuss it, and very much to my surprise actually, July, about 2 years ago, we had a breakfast at the Royal Society where the Secretary of State for Education then, Michael Gove, with his number 2, Lynn Truss, came together with Tristram Hunt, who was the Labour spokesman, and Kevin Brennan, who was his assistant, and David Laws, who was the Liberal spokesman, together with some civil servants for a breakfast which I chaired, saying, can we get agreement between the political parties that we will not fundamentally change the maths and science curricula over a considerable period, and we'll get a process for trying to work it through. And it was very good. It's not easy to get that agreement because it means the opposition has to give up its right to attack the government in certain areas. Anyway, it was agreed. It was fantastic. Michael Gove, to his credit, was ready to go along with it as well. So we agreed, and we had a short process which I would chair to finally set out the rules. That afternoon, Michael Gove was sacked as Education Minister. Lynn Truss, his deputy, was moved to a cabinet post, and the whole thing was transformed. We then tried to have a meeting with the person who replaced Michael Gove as the current Secretary of State, Nicky Morgan. She refused to meet to discuss any of this at any time in any way, even informally one-to-one, let alone recreate this meeting of all the leaders to discuss what happened. So the whole idea where there was almost agreement completely fell. And I tell that illustration to say that actually the task, even on a relatively trivial issue like maths and science exams, that task of getting a long-term agreement between the political parties as to how they proceed is very, very difficult politically to achieve, because the short-term advantages of having the right to attack the others become dominant. And that's what has to change. A long-termist political culture.
Can I pick up a parallel example on that, which is looking at other countries who've tried to do performance budgeting. So a classic conventional wisdom is that leadership matters, credible commitment of leaders matters a lot. And that's generally true, but we also found that when a reform got too associated with an individual leader, that could be a poison. So the next administration had a stronger incentive to throw it out. So places where they made some progress looked to try and institutionalize the process, to put some distance eventually between the leader and the reform, and to get bureaucrats essentially to buy in and lead the process.
Because, I'm struck that much of what's been said could be applied to the business world as well. I mean, you have short-termism in business, you have short tenure of leaders, you have programs that are aligned with one particular leader, then thrown out by the successor, and so on. Anyway, a whole bunch of fascinating issues. I want to call on Emine Elbajorst, who I know is an MPP student from Mongolia, to summarize some takeaways.
Hello. Thank you, and I just want to thank our very distinguished panel for a very stimulating discussion on a very important topic. And my 2 key points takeaway from this panel on transforming leadership in the public sector is to, as ministers and government, we need to provide a very strong direction on where we want to go and provide a consistent articulation of our goals, and also at the same time bring in new civil servants and utilize their new talents and skills and their new commitment and motivation while it is still strong and fresh. And also the second point is that I think we need to understand the culture and the challenges that are present in the civil service in order to address those challenges and in order to bring better leadership in that sector. And one thing that has surprised me from the panel is that, hearing the problems of the UK civil service and public sector, where, from Mongolia, I think it is the model that we are striving, and I wish we had back home. So thank you, and yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. It's been fantastic. There's, I think, now a short break before the next session. Thank you very much.